rising like medieval castles against gray, desolate hillsides. The early mental hospitals of the 20th century were monuments of both hope and horror. Their towers pierced the clouds like watchtowers guarding invisible prisoners. Long before psych wards became sterile white rooms, they were Gothic cathedrals of suffering, grand, ornate, and mercilessly isolated. You could see them from miles away, vast silhouettes of stone and iron, surrounded by empty fields. They weren't built near cities for convenience. They were built far enough that no one could hear the screams. To the men who designed them, these buildings weren't prisons. They were instruments of healing. At least, that's what Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride believed. In the late 1800s, this Philadelphia psychiatrist envisioned a new kind of treatment for the insane, one rooted in sunlight, space, and symmetry. His architectural philosophy, known as the Kirkbride Plan, called for sprawling hospitals with wings that spread outward in a batwing formation, long corridors filled with light and air. Each curve, each window, each brick was meant to calm a disturbed mind. Kirkbride wrote that the building itself is a curative instrument. He imagined a structure so humane, so orderly, that madness itself would dissolve within its walls. But somewhere between theory and reality, compassion turned into confinement. The very design meant to heal began to isolate. Kirkbride's beautiful blueprints became blueprints for despair. By the early 1900s, more than 70 asylums across America had been built in his image, each one an empire of stone and silence. Picture it. Vast wings stretching across acres of land, their facades carved from sandstone and granite, towers capped with copper domes that glinted red in the sunset. From above, the layouts resembled angels, or perhaps bats, spreading their wings. Inside, corridors ran for hundreds of feet, lined with polished brass doorknobs and barred windows. Gaslight flickered down endless hallways, casting long shadows that swallowed the patients whole. By day, sunlight streamed through tall arched windows, illuminating tiled floors and vaulted ceilings. By night, those same halls became labyrinths of whispers and distant screams. Nurses moved like ghosts through the gloom, their keys jangling in perfect rhythm with the cries that echoed from behind locked doors. Outside, the lawns were trimmed to perfection, flower beds in full bloom. A cruel irony for those who never saw them. The intent was noble, the execution was not. The curative instrument became a machine of control. Every hallway was designed to keep the staff in command. Every window was tall enough to let in light, but too high to climb. The wings that spread outward for fresh air and freedom became the architecture of separation. Male patients on one side, women on the other. The violent locked away from the melancholy. Every mind neatly classified, labeled, and stored like an exhibit in a museum of human suffering. Kirkbride could never have imagined what his legacy would become. In his writings, he insisted that every patient deserved dignity, that beauty itself was medicine. Yet as decades passed and populations swelled, the asylums turned into factories of despair. Designed for 600, they often held 3,000. The air that was supposed to heal became suffocating. The order meant to restore sanity became ritualized cruelty. Still, the architecture remains mesmerizing. Drone shots today reveal breathtaking ruins. Copper roofs gone green with age, arched doorways crumbling into dust, vines creeping through once sterile wards. Broken stained glass throws fragments of color across empty halls, where the ghosts of orderlies and patients still seem to linger. The silence now is almost sacred. The very buildings that once silenced the broken now tell stories louder than words. And yet, standing before these colossal remnants, one can't escape the contradiction. They were beautiful. Purposefully, painfully beautiful. The kind of beauty that hides its guilt behind craftsmanship. The kind of beauty that makes you forget what went on inside. The Kirkbride Plan was supposed to represent progress, the merging of science, architecture, and compassion. But what it created were psychological fortresses, elegant on the outside, oppressive within. These were not hospitals. They were monuments to misunderstanding. Each tower, each corridor, each carved stone was part of a grand delusion. That insanity could be cured by confinement, that madness could be outbuilt by masonry. Today, as the wind moves through shattered windows and echoes down decayed stairwells, it carries a strange echo, a whisper from an age that believed architecture could heal the soul. But those walls remember what the doctors forgot, that humanity cannot be contained in blueprints. These buildings were designed to heal the mind. Yet inside them, humanity lost its own. They called it progress, the idea that madness could be cured through architecture, that the shape of a building, the direction of its windows, even the rhythm of its corridors could heal a fractured mind. That was the promise of the Kirkbride Plan, a design so revolutionary, so humane in theory, that it became the blueprint for America's grandest mental institutions and its darkest mistakes. Thomas Story Kirkbride believed architecture could save the soul. The building itself is a curative instrument, he wrote, insisting that sunlight, symmetry, and silence could restore sanity. His hospitals were designed like great wings unfolding. Batwing. Formation spreading outward from a central administration block. Each wing was meant to separate patients by type, the curable, near the center, the hopeless, pushed farthest from view. From the sky, the design looked almost angelic, like wings protecting the broken. But on the ground, those wings felt more like the bars of an enormous, elegant cage. The symmetry was precise, almost divine. South-facing windows flooded the halls with light, long corridors stretched like arteries, and high ceilings created a cathedral-like stillness. But that same symmetry, that same beauty, became a symbol of control. Patients learned quickly that beauty didn't mean freedom. Those corridors that led to sunlight also led to locked doors. Every angle was a vantage point for staff to observe. Every turn in the architecture whispered, "You are being watched." If you look at a CGI model of a Kirkbride asylum today, viewed from above, it's breathtaking. Two vast wings arch outward like angel feathers, but look closer, and they start to resemble iron bars, a pattern of captivity disguised as care. The Buffalo State Hospital, built in 1870, was one of the first and grandest Kirkbride institutions. A sandstone fortress that locals called the castle. Its towers rose from the ground like the spires of some forgotten cathedral. Over 8 million red bricks, quarried by hand, pieced together into what was supposed to be a sanctuary for the sick. The walls were so thick they could muffle screams. The windows so narrow they admitted sunlight without offering escape. The hospital's first superintendent, Dr. James Dean, once wrote, "The very architecture speaks to the soul of the afflicted." And he was right, though not in the way he intended. The patients who lived there didn't hear compassion in those walls. They heard echoes. The shuffle of slippers on stone floors, the soft rattle of keys in the night, the low hum of suffering, contained but never cured. In surviving diaries from patients, you can feel the contradiction. One woman wrote, "The walls glow gold at dawn, and I think perhaps there is hope. But by dusk the light dies, and the walls close in again." Another scribbled, "They say these walls heal. Then why do I feel smaller every day?" To walk through Buffalo State's main hall was to feel the weight of purpose turned punishment. Ornate woodwork, marble staircases, frescoed ceilings, all built to uplift the spirit. Yet everything smelled faintly of carbolic acid and loneliness. Beauty became cruelty's disguise. Outside, the hospital lawns rolled green and perfect, dotted with fountains and flower beds. From a distance, it looked like a palace. Up close, the beauty felt mocking, a manicured world surrounding human decay. The patients inside could see the flowers through the windows, but never touch them. That was the cruel genius of the design hope, always visible but just out of reach. If Buffalo was a castle, Danvers State Hospital was a monument. Perched high on Hathorne Hill in Massachusetts, its jagged towers stabbed the sky like Gothic teeth. Locals whispered that it was the birthplace of lobotomy. And while the rumor was exaggerated, the truth was no less haunting. Built for 600 souls, Danvers eventually confined nearly 2,000. The air inside thickened with ammonia and grief. Batwing, wings that once symbolized healing now sagged under human weight. Hallways that had once echoed with the quiet shuffle of patients became crowded with bodies sleeping on floors. Windows, designed for sunlight, were covered in iron mesh. The grand idea of classification collapsed into chaos. Violent and docile patients thrown together, voices overlapping in endless cacophony. The smell of bleach could not hide the rot of despair. Visitors described walking through a fog of screams. Orderlies moved like soldiers in a war they could never win, pushing carts of sedatives, dragging away the struggling. The architecture that was meant to comfort had become complicit. Every arch and angle now a trap for noise, fear. At Greystone Park Asylum in New Jersey, it was the same story on a bigger scale. Built to house 600 patients, by the 1950s it held 7,000. The grand corridors were stuffed with cots. The dining halls overflowed. The air vents, once meant to circulate fresh air, only spread disease. Even the doctors began to lose track of names. Patients became numbers, numbers became noise. There's a famous photo. A nurse walking down a gray stone hallway lined on both sides by rows of beds, so close they nearly touch. Every face in the frame looks the same, dazed, hollow, erased. The building itself seems to absorb their hopelessness, the walls darkened by years of breath and sweat. The Kirkbride Plan had begun as a dream of balance, architecture reflecting order, order nurturing sanity. But by the 1920s, the dream had collapsed under the weight of human misery. What was supposed to be moral treatment had turned into mass confinement. The beautiful wings of healing had become the bones of something monstrous. If you stand in one of those ruins today, Buffalo, Danvers, Greystone, and speak softly, your voice will come back to you. The echo is eerie, delayed, as if the walls are still listening. Maybe they remember the patients who once pressed their hands against the cold stone and whispered prayers into the cracks. Maybe they remember the architects who believed, with all their hearts, that symmetry could save the soul. But the lesson of the Kirkbride Asylums isn't just about madness. It's about belief, about how easily good intentions can harden into cruelty when beauty blinds us to empathy, about how the very walls we build to protect can become cages we can't escape. And as the camera pans over the decaying roofs, the shattered glass, and the sun-bleached hallways, one truth lingers in the silence. They built sanctuaries for the mind, and ended up burying it instead. At Pilgrim State Hospital in the 1930s, life ran on the precision of a clock. Every second was accounted for. Every sound meant something. The clang of pipes before dawn, the thud of doors locking, the shriek of the morning whistle echoing through concrete corridors. It began at 5:30 a.m., when the lights flickered to life and the ward nurse's keys jangled down the hallway. The patient stirred, half asleep, to the sound of commands. Cold water, no towels, the weak shivered, the strong endured. Breakfast came next, 15 minutes. Not 16, not 14. Oatmeal, bread, black coffee. If you didn't finish, your food was taken away, recalled one patient years later. Order was mercy, silence was safety, talking was discouraged. Eye contact was rare. Every motion was supervised by attendants who moved in practiced rhythm. Ladle, serve, remove. The silence in the dining hall was heavier than any prayer. After breakfast, the machine began to hum. Doors unlocked one section at a time. Patients were herded to work assignments. The ones deemed fit, at least. In the laundry rooms, the air turned to steam. In the kitchens, knives scraped against metal. Those who disobeyed, those who broke rhythm, were sent to quiet rooms, padded cells where even thoughts seemed to echo back too loud. From above, the routine looked efficient, almost peaceful. From within, it felt endless, a life stripped to repetition. Time lost meaning when every day was identical to the one before. One former nurse described it bluntly. It was less a hospital and more a factory for broken minds. They called it occupational therapy. It sounded humane, even progressive, the belief that work could restore dignity. At Pilgrim State, Creedmoor, and Byberry, patients tilled acres of farmland, harvested crops, milked cows, sewed uniforms, and built furniture. The idea was that productive work would calm the restless mind, that sweat could wash away insanity. But behind that philosophy hid a quiet industry. These hospitals were nearly self-sustaining, fed by their own laborers, cleaned by their own captives, therapy or servitude. The question lingered in every shovel of dirt. On the fields, hundreds moved in slow unison, bent under the sun, digging, raking, planting. Many wore white smocks, their faces blank from medication. From a distance, it looked like order. Up close, it was exhaustion disguised as treatment. In the sewing rooms, women worked by the hundreds, repairing uniforms for the staff. In the kitchens, men scrubbed pans blackened by years of overuse. In the morgues, others carried out the silent work of the dead, cleaning, labeling, burning. For every task there was a reason. For every reason, a rationalization. A line from one patient's journal captures it perfectly. Work made me forget, but also erased who I was. Some found comfort in routine, the illusion of purpose. Others called it what it was, unpaid labor in the name of sanity. The administrators called it rehabilitation. But for the patients, it was the cost of existing in the asylum's economy. The buildings themselves enforced discipline. The architecture was the warden that never slept. Long corridors stretched in precise lines, so staff could see every corner, every movement. Windows weren't placed for beauty or light. They were positioned for observation. The patients learned early that there were no blind spots, only angles of exposure. Each wing had its own rhythm, its own choreography. The nurses moved in patterns, predictable, mechanical, almost hypnotic. The patients adapted their movements around them, learning when to speak, when to hide, when to breathe. The sound of footsteps in those halls wasn't random. It was authority in motion. In one archival interview, a former superintendent described it with pride. Wim built cathedrals to sanity, and then filled them with ghosts. The cathedrals had high ceilings that swallowed sound, and tiled floors that magnified it. Every shout became thunder. Every sob ricocheted off marble walls until it sounded inhuman. Even silence became unbearable. Patients sometimes whispered to themselves just to hear a familiar voice, proof they still existed. Doors were designed to be heavy, not for security but for submission. When they closed, they made a sound that stayed with you. Final, absolute. The same sound echoed through every asylum built on Kirkbride's Plan, a universal punctuation mark in the language of control. For staff, the architecture created illusion, the sense of order in chaos. For patients, it was a maze that led nowhere. She described it as God's eye view of order built on suffering. From up there, the grounds looked tranquil, gardens, fountains, red brick walls softened by ivy. But the sound rose through the windows like a pulse, metal on metal, screams mixed with hymns. From above, it was harmony. From inside, it was despair arranged in perfect geometry. The Kirkbride buildings were meant to heal through structure, through light and discipline, yet their very design, long wings radiating from a central hub, created distance, isolation, and the illusion of control. The farther a patient was from the center, the more hopeless their condition was considered. Hope had an architectural address, and most never reached it. Each ward had its own scent, its own soundscape. The upper floors, where the recovering patient stayed, smelled faintly of soap and linen. The lower floors stank of mildew, sweat, and neglect. The architecture amplified that hierarchy. Beauty at the entrance, decay at the ends. Visitors saw polished corridors and airy common rooms. Only staff and inmates knew that 2 doors down, beneath the chapel windows, were the quiet wards, where screams were muffled by thick stone and time moved differently. It was a paradox that defined the early 20th century asylum. The more beautifully it was built, the more cruelly it functioned. A mental health historian once put it simply: they built systems to restore sanity, but forgot that systems can go mad too. By the late 1920s, even the administrators could no longer ignore what the architecture had become. A machine for control disguised as a sanctuary. The once bright halls now reeked of disinfectant and despair. Paint peeled like old skin. Radiators hissed like tired lungs. Every inch of stone that once symbolized progress now whispered the same truth. It wasn't the patients who had failed. It was the dream itself. And so, the architecture of isolation began to consume its creators. Doctors spoke less of healing and more of management. Nurses stopped calling patients by name. The system became self-sustaining, feeding on its own order. As one surviving patient wrote in her hidden notebook, later found inside a library wall during demolition, "They said the building was built to make us better, but I think it only made us easier to forget." The blueprints of hope had become blueprints of despair. The Batwing formation that once symbolized moral treatment now resembled the spread of something darker. An institution expanding not to heal, but to contain. And when the final doors of these hospitals closed decades later, the echoes didn't fade, they lingered. In the cracks of the walls, in the corridors left to dust, in the silence that followed. The architecture had done what it was designed to do. It controlled, it categorized, it consumed. But in doing so, it revealed something profound. When the human mind is confined by design, even the walls begin to remember. Transition. By the 1920s, the dream of moral treatment had crumbled beneath the weight of human misery. The buildings still stood tall, but inside, humanity was being slowly dismantled one routine at a time. By the 1930s, the asylums had become laboratories, and patients, unwilling test subjects. What began as moral reform evolved into medical obsession. Psychiatrists, desperate to prove that madness had a physical cure, reached for electricity, insulin, and scalpels. Dr. Walter Freeman, known as the father of the lobotomy, called his method a shortcut to peace. His tool wasn't a scalpel, but an ice pick, hammered through the eye socket into the brain's frontal lobe. He called it transorbital lobotomy. The first time he did it, he said, it was like turning off the noise inside the skull. In reality, it silenced much more. Freeman performed over 500 lobotomies, sometimes in hospital parking lots, inside his lobotomobile, a Chevrolet he converted into a traveling operating room. The procedure left thousands incapacitated, their emotions blunted, memories erased. One of his most famous patients was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of a future U.S. president. After the procedure, she could barely speak, barely move. She spent the rest of her life institutionalized, the embodiment of a generation's medical hubris. The camera lingers on Freeman's surgical tray, ice pick, mallet, cotton gauze, tools of science turned relics of horror. If knives could not fix the mind, perhaps shock could. In New York's Pilgrim State Hospital, patients were lined up for insulin shock therapy. A doctor injected massive doses of insulin until their bodies convulsed and their brains shut down into a coma. Then, they were revived with glucose, if they woke at all. Records show that between 1936 and 1945, over 2,000 patients underwent this treatment. Reports claimed an 88% cure rate, but post-mortem reviews told another story. Dozens died, many more relapsed, and most never recovered. A nurse's diary found decades later described it like this. They would shake, foam at the mouth, then lie still. When they woke, they didn't remember their name. Some said that was progress. Then came electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Electricity is salvation. The first experiments were conducted on pigs in Rome's slaughterhouses. Researchers noticed that animals stunned by electric current convulsed but didn't die. Soon, the same current was used on humans. By the 1940s, ECT spread across America. Hospitals processed up to 100 patients per day without anesthesia or muscle relaxants. Bones broke, teeth shattered, but doctors called it success. Dr. Abraham Myerson once said, "These people have more intelligence than they can handle." The reduction of intelligence is an important part of the cure. That line, spoken with pride, captures the horror of an era that mistook control for compassion. The next frontier of healing wasn't in the lab, it was in the bathroom. Hydrotherapy became the catch-all cure. At Buffalo State Hospital, Dr. John Pierce introduced the needle shower. Dozens of thin, high-pressure jets alternating between hot and cold, aimed at the naked body for hours. In some wards, patients were submerged in bathtubs for days, restrained by canvas covers so they couldn't escape. Only their heads remained above water. Nurses rotated towels soaked in ice water over their faces to maintain calm, one physician proudly wrote in his report. The temperature of the body and the soul must be brought under control. But for those who endured it, the memory never left. One former patient wrote decades later, "I no longer fear drowning. I already have." Beyond the medical wings lay rooms designed for silence. Isolation chambers, called quiet rooms, lined the basements of many hospitals. The walls were padded with horsehair or leather, meant to prevent self-injury. But inside, patients were left for days or months, alone. At Danvers State Hospital, staff referred to these as the tombs. One attendant's 1921 journal read, "Down there, you lose track of time. You hear breathing, but it might be your own." For restraint, doctors turned to devices that would look more at home in a medieval dungeon. The Utica crib, a wooden cage shaped like a bed, was used to immobilize restless patients. The tranquilizer chair, invented by Dr. Benjamin Rush, strapped the body tight and restricted blood flow to the brain, believed to calm the passions. Dr. Rush was called the father of American psychiatry. His tools looked like instruments of confession, even at sane. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., considered one of the more progressive institutions, records from 1923 show that 60% of patients were physically restrained at some point during treatment. A former nurse summarized it best: "We didn't treat madness. We just kept it quiet." By the late 1940s, cracks appeared in the machine. Journalists began sneaking inside wards with hidden cameras. Whistleblowers leaked medical records. Hollywood actress Frances Farmer, institutionalized after a public breakdown, described her treatments in her memoir, Will There Really Be a Morning? Insulin shock, forced baths, isolation, and restraints. Her story horrified the public. For the first time, people saw that these hospitals were not sanctuaries, they were prisons with medical degrees. By 1950, psychiatry stood at a crossroads, reform or ruin. But the damage had already been done. The science of suffering had produced a century's worth of broken minds and silenced voices. As one anonymous patient wrote on the back of a hospital form, later discovered in the archives of the Worcester State Hospital, they said the pain was progress. But progress should not make you wish to die. The doctors believed they were curing madness. In truth, they were studying obedience. The human mind was never the patient, it was the experiment. By the mid-19th century, a new epidemic was sweeping across Europe and America, not of fever, but of female hysteria. Doctors claimed it was caused by wandering wombs, emotional excess, and uncontrolled intellect. In truth, it was rebellion, punished with diagnosis. More than 75% of asylum patients were women. Their illnesses had names like melancholia, moral insanity, and domestic disobedience. A woman could be committed for reading novels, neglecting housework, refusing intimacy, or simply questioning her husband's authority. Medical journals advised that overeducation could damage a woman's mind. One record from the Bloomingdale Asylum lists reasons for female admission: novel reading, spiritualism, masturbation, ambition, and disappointment in love. Each one reflects not sickness, but a society's terror of female independence. Inside the wards, white uniforms replaced wedding gowns and silence became law. Doctors believed that women's bodies were inherently unstable, slaves to their nervous temperaments. The prescription wasn't freedom but submission. A chilling quote from Dr. Ware Mitchell, the father of the rest cure, still echoes through time. The best remedy for a nervous woman is to have her will controlled. And so thousands of women were confined, not for losing their minds, but for using them. In 1889, a young woman named Alice Mitchell was admitted to a Tennessee asylum after expressing her desire to live like a man. Her crime wasn't violence, it was identity. "I simply wish to study engineering," she told the doctors. That statement alone was enough to brand her as insane. Her case was sensationalized in newspapers. Girl who thought herself a man. Society couldn't comprehend a woman wanting autonomy, much less ambition. Inside the asylum, they called her delusional. The prescribed cure, hydrotherapy, the scene is almost cinematic in cruelty. Nurses drag her to a tiled room where the air smells of bleach and rust. She's stripped of her clothes, bound to a metal chair. Cold water bursts from brass nozzles above, pounding her skin in rhythmic blasts. She gasps, trembles, cries out, but no one listens. Each session lasts 20 minutes. The water alternates between near freezing and scalding hot. The goal, doctors said, was to restore feminine passivity. Afterward, they dry her off, dress her in a hospital gown, and lead her back to the ward. Soaked, shivering, and silent, her medical chart reads, condition improving, speech quieter, temper softened. But her personal notes, smuggled out years later, tell another story. Each bath took something from me. I no longer recognize the sound of my own voice. Alice's mind was not the disease. The world's refusal to let her exist was. Few treatments reveal the cruelty of compassion. Like the rest cure, its architect, Dr. Silas Ware Mitchell, was a man of prestige and blind conviction. His treatment forbade women from reading, writing, or thinking too deeply. They were confined to bed, fed milk and broth, and forbidden contact with the outside world. It was meant to heal nerves. Instead, it shattered souls. In 1887, writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman underwent the rest cure after suffering postpartum depression. Her doctor ordered, live as domestic a life as possible. Never touch pen, brush, or pencil again. She obeyed until she almost lost her sanity. From that torment came her masterpiece, the yellow wallpaper. I sometimes fancy that in my condition, if I had less opposition and more society and stimulus. But what is one to do? Her story, a woman confined to a room whose wallpaper comes alive, became a metaphor for the suffocation of women under medical and marital control. The protagonist's descent into madness was not a symptom, it was resistance. When the story was published, doctors dismissed it as fiction, but patients recognized the truth. The wallpaper wasn't madness, it was the mirror. Gilman later wrote, "The treatment was so nearly the one I describe that the story might have been a direct result of my own mind's escape." Through her words, the walls of the asylum cracked and a movement began. By the early 1900s, women were not just rebelling against husbands, they were rebelling against systems. The suffragette movement demanded the right to vote, to work, to own property, and in response, the patriarchy found a new diagnosis: moral insanity. In England, suffragettes like Constance Lytton were arrested and declared mentally unstable for hunger striking. Doctors justified force, feeding them through metal tubes, claiming it was for their safety. Lytton later wrote, "They called us hysterical when we starved for justice." In America, activists like Elizabeth Packard faced similar fates. Her husband, a minister, had her committed to the Illinois State Hospital simply for disagreeing with his sermons. She spent 3 years locked away, her sanity questioned, her faith weaponized against her. When she finally escaped, Packard sued and won. Her case exposed a devastating truth under U.S. law. Any husband could institutionalize his wife without trial. Her victory led to the Packard Law of 1867, which required judicial review before commitment. Her words in court resounded across the country. "They called me insane because I dared to think for myself." Women like Packard, Lytton, and Gilman transformed private suffering into public revolution. Their madness became their message. And yet, for every woman who escaped, thousands more remained behind walls, their stories erased. Medical records described them as recovered, relapsed, or unresponsive. The human behind the diagnosis vanished. One asylum note from 1912 reads, "Patient refused to eat. When offered bread, asked for a book instead. Delusional persistence continues." That one sentence captures a century's tragedy. Intellect mistaken for illness, willpower rewritten as insanity. The 20th century brought modern psychiatry, and with it, a new fear: the uncontrollable woman. Films like Gaslight and The Snake Pit mirrored society's anxiety about women's independence. Psychiatry labeled them borderline, hysterical, or neurotic. The asylum's language evolved, but the diagnosis stayed the same. Women who defied expectations were unwell. Medical advertisements even targeted housewives, urging them to seek treatment for nervous exhaustion. The cure: barbiturates and electric shock. The mid-century saw a quiet epidemic of sedation, women numbed, not healed. Psychiatrist Phyllis Chesler, in her 1972 book, Woman and Madness, revealed that women were still twice as likely to be diagnosed with depression and 3 times more likely to be institutionalized. She wrote, "Madness is the female malady, not because women are sick, but because the world makes them so." Behind every diagnosis was a demand: conform or be cured. Today, the term female hysteria has vanished from medical manuals, but its shadow lingers in the way women's pain is still dismissed. Studies show women are more likely to be told their symptoms are stress-related or psychosomatic. The asylum has evolved. It wears a lab coat now. One historian described it perfectly. We no longer lock women away in asylums. We simply question their credibility. The gendered legacy of madness continues in subtler forms, from the misdiagnosis of women with ADHD or autism to the minimization of postpartum depression. The asylum's architecture has dissolved, but its philosophy remains control disguised as care. They called it madness when women refused to be silent. But silence, forced, medicated, and institutionalized, was the real disease. By the mid-20th century, the asylums began to die, not with fire, but with silence. One by one, their gates closed, their corridors emptied, their echoes left to rot. The era of moral treatment had collapsed under scandal, overcrowding, and exposure. Investigations revealed what many had whispered for decades, that the hospitals meant to heal had become machines of cruelty. In 1972, Life magazine published a shocking exposé titled Bedlam 1972. The images showed patients naked, restrained, crawling across urine-soaked floors. America looked into the mirror of its own compassion and recoiled. By the 1980s, deinstitutionalization swept the country. Thousands of patients were released, promised new beginnings through community care that never truly came. The buildings were abandoned overnight, beds still made, files still open, shoes still lined neatly by doors that no one would walk through again. And in their place, silence thick enough to feel alive. The ghosts left behind were not supernatural. They were memory, grief, and the faint hum of electricity in rusted wires that once fed 1,000 minds. If architecture could dream, Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts would still be dreaming. Built in 1878, it rose like a Gothic cathedral, its towers clawing at the clouds. Local legend says it inspired the setting for Arkham Asylum in Batman. But its real story was darker. Danvers was supposed to hold 600 patients. At its peak, it held over 2,000. The corridors were endless, lined with peeling green paint, fluorescent buzz, and the faint, sour smell of disinfectant that never quite left. When it finally closed in 1992, urban explorers found medical charts scattered across the floors, names, dates, treatments, all frozen in decay. One document reads, "Patient 47 sings to herself in the dark, believes she is still home." Decades later, locals swear that on cold nights, you can still hear faint humming from the upper floors. Not ghosts, but the echo of repetition, the sound of lives reduced to routine. Danvers was partially demolished in 2006. Luxury apartments now stand on the land where shock therapy once hummed. But beneath the manicured lawns lie tunnels that were never filled, damp, silent arteries of an empire that refused to die. One former nurse, interviewed years later, said quietly, "You can paint the walls, but the air remembers." In New Jersey, Park Psychiatric Hospital stood like a sleeping giant. Built in 1876, its batwing structure stretched nearly a quarter-mile long, the largest building in America at the time. To some, it was a monument of hope. To others, a prison of the mind. When it closed in 2008, nature moved in faster than demolition crews. Ivy crawled up sandstone towers, rainwater pooled in hallways, and silence became the new superintendent. Graffiti covered the walls, but not all of it was vandalism. Some was remembrance. On one crumbling wall, written in careful cursive, "I was here for 10 years. Please tell my brother I remember him." The words have since faded, but photographs preserve them, proof that even when the body leaves, the soul lingers in dust and ink. Musicians and artists began visiting Greystone for inspiration, calling it America's purgatory. One filmmaker described it best, "Every sound here is a memory trying to escape." When Greystone was finally demolished in 2015, former patients protested outside the gates. One held a sign that read, "Don't bury my past. I was real." They weren't protecting a ruin. They were protecting a record of what the world tried to forget. Not all asylums were erased. Some became museums, sanctuaries for their own ghosts. At the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, guided tours lead visitors through decayed wards and rusted gurneys. The air is thick with dust and stories. Tour guides speak softly, as though afraid to wake something. They show visitors rooms with labels like hydrotherapy, seclusion, and recreation. In one corner, a child's doll lies beneath shattered glass. The guide explains, "This belonged to a patient who never spoke. When she died, no one claimed her body. The doll stayed. It's not a haunted house. It's a monument. Each peeling layer of paint carries a story of someone who was never allowed to tell theirs." Psychologists and historians argue that these spaces shouldn't be romanticized, but to walk their halls is to feel history breathing through the walls. Not just madness, but humanity. The museum's curator once said, We preserve these places not to glorify pain, but to remember what silence costs. Today, the ghosts of the asylums walk among us, not as specters, but as systems. The architecture of isolation has become invisible cubicles, hospital wards, prisons, and screens. The same design principles, observation, control, and order, live on in modern institutions. The corridors are cleaner now, but the distance between human and humane remains. Mental illness is no longer hidden, yet stigma lingers. The world has moved from iron bars to invisible chains. Social media perfection, pharmaceutical dependence, and the quiet panic of existing in a world that still fears vulnerability. A former patient of a modern psychiatric unit once said, "They don't lock the doors anymore, but they still take your name." The ghosts left behind are not asking for vengeance. They're asking to be seen, to be remembered not as monsters, but as mirrors, reflections of how a civilization measures compassion through its treatment of the broken. As the camera pans over cracked windows and rusted beds, a voice whispers beneath the wind, "These walls were meant to heal the mind." But in the end, they only revealed the soul. The echo fades, the music deepens, a final title appears. The mind remembers what the world chooses to forget. And then, darkness. By the 1930s, asylums across the world were bursting with patients. The walls had stopped healing and started suffocating. The medical world, desperate to prove its relevance, shifted from philosophy to experiment. The question was no longer why people suffered, but how far one could go to stop it. The word, treatment, took on a chilling new form. Electric currents, surgical blades, and chemical cocktails replaced the moral therapy of the Kirkbride age. Doctors believed that by reshaping the body, they could reshape the soul. The asylum transformed into a laboratory, where minds were opened, altered, and often erased. Psychiatrist Walter Freeman said it best, though he never saw the irony: to cure the mind, we must first conquer it. And so began the era when science lost its reflection, and compassion became an experiment. The first electric shock therapy was performed in Italy in 1938 by Dr. Ugo Cerletti. He had observed that pigs in slaughterhouses, stunned by electricity before death, appeared momentarily calm. The logic was grotesque. If electricity could pacify an animal, could it also pacify a man? The results were dramatic: convulsions, memory loss, shattered bones, yet patients sometimes appeared subdued afterward. To doctors, that silence meant success. Soon, the practice spread like gospel across the United States. By the 1940s, electroconvulsive therapy (ECT) had become the asylum's lightning storm. At Pilgrim State Hospital, nurses wheeled patients into tiled rooms reeking of disinfectant. They'd strap a rubber block between the teeth, clamp electrodes to the temples, and flood the skull with current. The body would seize violently, a macabre ballad of science and suffering. Afterward, patients woke confused, compliant and vacant. Doctors called it resetting the mind. Patients called it erasure. One survivor later recalled, "I forgot my own name, but they said I looked happier." To the medical eye, it was progress. To the human soul, it was the quietest form of annihilation. No figure embodies the era's madness like Dr. Walter Freeman, the self-proclaimed pioneer of the lobotomy. His vision was seductive, a quick, bloodless operation that could calm even the most violent mind. His weapon of choice, an ice pick. Freeman believed that emotions lived in the frontal lobes, and that by severing them, one could silence suffering itself. Psychic surgery. In truth, it was psychological mutilation. In 1946, Freeman introduced the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure that required no anesthesia, only a hammer and a steady hand. The pick slid beneath the eyelid, through the thin bone of the eye socket and into the brain. One tap, then another. Twist, disconnect, repeat. He toured the country in his van, which he nicknamed the Lobotomobile, performing thousands of procedures in state hospitals, often on women and children. In one case, a 12-year-old boy named Howard Dully was lobotomized because he was difficult to manage. He later wrote, "He destroyed a part of me that could have been my future." Freeman saw himself as a savior. He photographed patients before and after surgery, smiling in the second frame, slack-jawed and vacant. Newspapers praised him as the man who made lunacy curable. But the truth was horror. Some patients died on the table. Others survived, empty, docile, incapable of feeling joy or grief. The asylum's dream of healing architecture had turned into architecture of obedience. When asked if he ever regretted it, Freeman replied, "Regret implies doubt. I cured thousands." Yet the silence of those he cured says more than history ever could. The 1950s brought a new kind of salvation, one bottled, not wired. With the invention of thorazine, psychiatry found its miracle drug. Hospitals called it the chemical lobotomy. Patients stopped screaming, stopped resisting, stopped being. Thorazine calmed the wards, reduced staff injuries, and turned chaos into quiet. Pharmaceutical companies marketed it as peace in a pill. For administrators drowning in overcrowding, it was divine intervention. For patients, it was a fog that never lifted. Doctors described its effects clinically: flattened affect, diminished motivation, psychomotor slowing. But patients used simpler words. "I feel like furniture." Thorazine became the new straitjacket, invisible, efficient, and endlessly profitable. It marked the beginning of the pharmaceutical age, when madness became a business model and medication replaced understanding. In one haunting hospital report from 1956, a nurse wrote, "Ward calm, no incidents. Most patients asleep by 3 p.m., peace perhaps, but at what cost?" Science wasn't the only hand that reached for the afflicted. Religion had never fully left the asylum. It merely changed robes. Some doctors, desperate for control, reintroduced spiritual therapy. In small-town hospitals, priests worked alongside psychiatrists, blurring the line between faith and medicine. At St. Mary's Institution in Pennsylvania, nuns recorded cases where doctors prescribed prayer instead of treatment. Patients labeled possessed were subjected to modern exorcisms, bright lights, holy water, and whispered Latin over shaking bodies. One nun's journal entry reads, "The doctor says electricity calms the mind. The priest says it drives out the devil." Neither has seen peace in her eyes. The belief that madness was moral failure persisted well into the 1960s. Homosexuality, defiance, even grief could be treated as spiritual corruption. In some hospitals, corrective therapies combined both worlds: electric shocks accompanied by prayers, or confessions recorded on tape and replayed during sedation. The human mind was still an object to be subdued, whether by voltage, blade, or belief. The experiments weren't just procedures. They were philosophies carved into flesh. Behind every scientific milestone was a graveyard of forgotten names. At Willowbrook State School, mentally disabled children were deliberately infected with hepatitis to study transmission. At Laurelton State Village, women labeled feeble-minded were sterilized under eugenics laws to purify the population. A surviving nurse from the era confessed decades later, "We thought we were helping. We thought we were saving them from themselves. But now I wonder if we were saving the world from their reflection." The irony was unbearable. In trying to cure madness, society had institutionalized it. The asylums had become mirrors, showing humanity its own appetite for control. By the 1970s, public outrage finally broke the illusion. Investigations, lawsuits, documentaries. They exposed what was done in the name of progress. The most haunting was the film Titicut Follies 1967, banned for decades for its unfiltered portrayal of cruelty inside a Massachusetts asylum. Governments began closing institutions, universities revised ethics codes, and medicine began to reckon with its ghosts. The lobotomy was outlawed. Shock therapy was restricted. Patients gained the right to refuse treatment. But progress never feels clean. Some survivors emerged into a world that didn't want them. Homeless, traumatized, chemically dependent. The scars of the asylum lived in their eyes. A woman once interviewed outside the ruins of Greystone said, "They took my mind, then gave me back my body. I don't know which was worse." Science had set out to exorcise the demons of madness, but it ended up creating new ones. Electricity, scalpels, and chemicals were not tools of healing. They were instruments of control wrapped in the language of compassion. As the lights flicker over the rusted remains of an operating room, a voice murmurs. They called it progress. We called it pain. The story of the asylum began with light, with hope, with the dream that architecture could heal the human soul. Thomas Story Kirkbride envisioned buildings that breathed compassion. He designed them with long, sunlit corridors, wide courtyards, and high ceilings meant to inspire recovery. The asylum, in its conception, was not a prison. It was a sanctuary for the broken. But dreams can decay faster than stone. Kirkbride's ideals, order, air, and sunlight, were slowly replaced by overcrowding, isolation, and obedience. The same walls built to heal began to confine. The same corridors that once carried fresh air became tunnels of despair. Beauty became camouflage for cruelty. Every door locked, for safety, became a symbol of control. Every treatment, electric, surgical, or chemical, was a confession of how far humanity would go to silence suffering instead of understanding it. The asylum system revealed something profound and terrible, that good intentions, when stripped of empathy, can become instruments of horror. And yet, the story does not end in darkness. From the ashes of those failed fortresses rose a new philosophy, compassion through understanding. The field of psychiatry began to listen, not just observe. Activists fought for patient rights. Former inmates became advocates, storytellers, and reformers. Art, literature, and film carried their voices out of the walls that once held them. The same society that once whispered madness now begins to speak of trauma, empathy, and recovery. The same walls that echoed with screams now house museums, memorials, and lessons. Kirkbride's dream was never wrong, only incomplete. Buildings alone cannot heal, compassion can. To reflect on the asylum is to confront our collective conscience, the uncomfortable truth that progress often begins in cruelty, and that mercy is not inherited but earned. Italian reformer Franco Basaglia once wrote, "The asylum is not a fortress to conquer, it is a mistake to correct." That correction continues in every counselor who listens without judgment, in every patient treated with dignity, in every system that chooses care over control. As the camera drifts through the ruins, sunlight breaking through shattered glass, vines reclaiming the stone, the voice returns, soft and resolute. From the ashes of cruelty rose compassion, from silence, understanding. The walls may crumble, but the lesson remains: how we treat the weakest among us defines who we truly are. A single heartbeat echoes, slow, steady, of silence.